So you ready?
Yeah, I am.
Okay.
Yeah.
Stand.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I just want to say a very brief welcome and hello. My name is Dr. Miriam Gray, and I have the privilege of being the Associate Director and Director of Graduate Studies here at Glucksman Ireland House. I'm just not going to say very much, which is kind of unlike me, for any of you who know me. I'm just going to ask you for now to, if you wouldn't mind, silencing your cell phones. And I'm going to introduce you to the co-founder of Glucksman Ireland House and the chair of our board, Loretta Brennan-Glucksman, who will introduce, who will just say a warm welcome, and then Marion Casey is going to more formally introduce Hasia Diner. We're very excited about this evening's event. So Loretta Brennan-Glucksman.
Thank you, Miriam. Welcome, everyone. Hi, Charlotte. I love these events because it's not only a homecoming, which it always feels like, but it's a gathering that reminds me of exactly why Lou and I tried to do something. We had no clue what it would be 25 years ago. And the fact that we are here with the same quality of people that gathered around us 25 years ago, if anything, it's going up. And that's very comforting in this chaotic age. So thank you all from various aspects of the Irish American community. You make it all make sense, and that's not always easy. We are going to have a fantastic celebration for our 25th year, and we have been blessed by so many almost fluky things that have happened just in the last few months. As we all know, our beloved Joe Lee returned to Ireland to work on and complete his essential body of work. And I'm still mad at him, but I certainly understand, and it was an essential move, not only for Joe, but for everyone that values amazing scholarship when it's addressed to the Irish experience. And that is certainly the work of J.J. Lee. So he will be back, and we will have the benefit of his company and always his advice. But the most magical thing happened just after we had to deal with that big announcement. We were left with needing to find an interim director of Ireland House until there could be the requisite international search. And again, God smiled on this little place, and a very respected member of the NYU community, Hasia Diner, who has run the Center for Judaic Studies for many years to great respect and applause. She said she would love to do it. And since we were hoping to keep our theme for the 25th celebration, and thanks to Mick Maloney, if it weren't for the Irish and the Jews. So we are living that wonderful truism thanks to Hasia. And then, never being shy of pushing our luck, we asked her if she would make this lecture tonight. And again, she generously said yes. Marion Casey will give a much more erudite background on Hasia and why we are so damn lucky. Her accomplishments in academia and as a scholar are world known. And she has been so generous with us and so collegial and so supportive. So as just a personal thank you, Hasia, I am deeply, deeply grateful, and we're loving every minute with you. And now I will ask Dr. Marion Casey to do the grown-up stuff.
Thank you, Loretta. You're always a gracious woman and
hard act to follow. So tonight we gather for the inaugural lecture in a Jewish-Irish themed series that is marking the 25th anniversary of Glucksman Ireland House in 2018. Our speaker, as you know, is Hasia Diner. She's the Paul and Sylvia Steinberg Professor of American Jewish History and Director of the Goldstein-Goren Center for American Jewish History at New York University. She is also a Fellow of the American Academy for Jewish Research and a member of the Society of American Historians, and one of only 20 living women historians included in the biographical dictionary of American women historians that covers 3 centuries, 1700s to 1900s. As Loretta mentioned, she has a long list of publications, and this is just a few to give you a sense of the range. The Jews of the United States, 1654 to 2000. We remember with reverence and love American Jews and the myth of silence after the Holocaust, 1945 to 1962, and that was the winner of the National Jewish Book Award in 2009. Lower East Side Memories, A Jewish Place in America. In the Almost Promised Land, American Jews and Blacks, 1915 to 1935. And most recently, Julius Rosenwald, Repairing the World, which is a biography of the businessman and philanthropist who was connected with Sears Roebuck. And that's part of Yale University Press's Jewish Lives series. So as you can, you get a glimpse here that Hasia is a giant in the field of Jewish studies, but she's also an internationally recognized historian of race, gender, and ethnicity in America. As she recently wrote about her own work, and this is a quote, you'll forgive me, okay? It not only gave me a broad forum from which to present my ideas, a wide perspective from which to experiment with what ultimately fascinated me and made me an historian. That is the question of how women and men in the past decided what to do and under what circumstances. How they confronted the changes in the world around them, whether economic, social, or cultural, and how among the usually limited choices available, how did they respond? What forces weighed down upon them and constricted them? And what opportunities gave them the possibilities of acting and asserting their individual and collective agencies? Now that motivation has prompted Hasia to include Ireland and the Irish in her research over the years, resulting in 3 major books: Erin's Daughters in America, Irish immigrant women in the 19th century, 1983, Hungering for America, Italian, Irish, and Jewish Foodways in the Age of Migration, 2003, and most recently, Roads Taken, The Great Jewish Migrations to the New World and the Peddlers Who Forged the Way, in 2015. All this wealth of knowledge and reflection is shared with students in a course Hasia co-teaches with Glucksman Ireland House faculty called Irish and Jewish Migrations to America, which is just one example of the ongoing relationship between Irish studies and Hebrew and Judaic studies at NYU. And I'd like to take a moment to thank the Goldstein-Goren Center for American Jewish History for co-sponsoring this evening's lecture that will explore the American encounters between the Irish and the Jews. The daughter of immigrants, Hasia was raised in Milwaukee and educated at the University of Wisconsin at Madison and the University of Illinois. She taught at the University of Maryland, College Park, and American University in Washington, D.C. before arriving at NYU in 1996. When Glucksman Ireland House was just 3 years old. So in some respects, we have come of age together over the past couple of decades. And it is therefore both fitting and a unique privilege to introduce you to our new interim director who succeeded Joe Lee upon his retirement last September. We are but a minor chord in the symphony that is her professional career, but we cherish the opportunity we have been given to make music with this wonderful woman. And on behalf of the Board of Advisors, the faculty, and the staff of Glucksman Ireland House, please welcome Hasia Diner to the podium.
I think it was lovelier than I deserved. So let me begin with a quote, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the parameters of my lecture, and then I will move right into it. So this is a quote from an article that appeared in a magazine called The American Hebrew in the year 1881, a momentous year in Jewish history. It was the year of the first outbreak of the pogroms in Ukraine, and erroneously, historians have dated the beginnings of the mass East European Jewish migration to America in 1881, although it actually began well before that. But here's the quote. Between the Irish and the Jews, there would seem to be a very striking resemblance, inasmuch as both races have, through centuries of persecution, carried with them an individuality which effectively prevented them from either exterminated or absorbed into the stronger and conquering peoples. Different forms of civilization and different races of men succeeded each other in different epochs of world history. But now in Europe, there don't seem to be any two people whose traditions and racial unity are so strong and unbroken from our own time since the pre-Christian period as the Irish and the Jews. So I want to start with words of thank you. I know that, as you know, this is the silver anniversary of Glucksman Ireland House, and the anniversary year has been pegged to analyzing in words and music and moving images the many interactions and linkages and connections between America's Irish and Jewish populations, exploring the ways, times, and institutions where the daughters and sons of Aaron and Israel, to be a bit trite here, and hopefully that's going to be my own tritism, met each other in the United States, and where they, despite the very different places they had come from, imagined each other, engaged with each other, whether in alliance or opposition, whether reaching similar or different conclusions about the common struggles and the prospects facing a minority group in urban America, and in the course of that, how they changed America. Now, I do want to thank everybody involved here. I want to thank the deans who asked me to step up and serve as the interim director of Ireland House. I want to thank the wonderful faculty at this institution who have greeted me with such warmth and open arms and never made me feel like I'm an interloper imposed upon them by the administration. Okay, and I want to thank Loretta and all the other builders and dreamers who do so much of the heavy lifting for Ireland House and who have expressed nothing but warmth and appreciation and welcome for me in this capacity. I'm also humbled in this position as acting director, interim director, to follow the years of Joe Lee's wonderful service he performed with vision and charm. Now, I wouldn't even remotely approach Joe's charm or his wit. I cannot talk as fast. I cannot talk as expressively or as intricately as he does. But I hope that in the course of this year that I'm here, that I'll carry over some of his vision and dedication to sustaining an important academic institution, one dedicated to studying the Irish in America, Ireland, and the Irish diaspora, and the ways in which the women and men in and from a small spot in the Atlantic did some very big things in the course of their lives at home and in the many places to which they went. Now, as Marion noted, I've taught a course here originally with Bob Scally, and then last couple of years with Marion on Jewish-Irish migration to America. I've always felt very comfortable doing this, and every time I walk into Ireland House, I feel very much at home. It doesn't seem to be at all unusual or surprising that I am here. This stands in some difference from the reaction I often get from other historians when I say, like when I was working on Aaron's Daughters in America, or working on Hungering for America, and certainly when I took on this position, when they couldn't understand why it was I was studying the Irish. Okay, they understood I was Jewish in background in my life, They often responded with what I would consider pretty idiotic comments, like, what, are you going to change your name to O'Diner or something? Now, I say that as a scholar, there's no subject that's not worth studying. There's no topic that one has to explain what drew you to it, but rather the intellectual problems that are generated by that particular experience. And certainly as a scholar of American immigration and ethnic history, the idea that one would study one group, okay, and think of it in a silo, and never look beyond, makes for poorer scholarship rather than illuminates the larger problem. And as such, I certainly don't feel that there's any need to justify why I have studied what I have studied. So these are important matters. The history of the United States has been deeply inflected by the fact that millions of women and men from Ireland and millions of Jews from Europe came to America as permanent immigrants. And upon their arrival, these largely working class individuals began a process of coming to terms with the reality that as religious outsiders, Catholics and Jews, they confronted a deeply Protestant, militantly at times American public, one which defined America as theirs by virtue of their faith and by virtue of the founding myth that they were the ones who were here first. How Jews and Irish worked together to move the nation away from that belief, and in the process how they helped America redefine American culture, tells us much about them and their progeny and about America. Now, I do want to say before I get into the substance of the material that when one uses the words Irish, in my notes they're in quotes, and Jewish in quotes, that we have to understand that these are internally divided entities on matters both within their communities and beyond. The phrases Irish American or American Jews are highly contentious. People debate among themselves what they mean, what is the right way to be Irish or Jewish in America. Both groups divided internally along a kaleidoscopic range of fissures vis-a-vis class, ideology, politics, definitions of respectability, relationships to the homeland, and how to present themselves to their American neighbors. So please keep in mind that I understand how complicated all these terms are. Now, I want to just say two things that I'm not going to talk about, although I think they're not unimportant in their own context. I'm not going to be doing comparisons. I'm not going to look at the range of issues that immigration and ethnic historians attend to and say and list points of similarity and points of difference. I'm not going to look at where they converged politically or where they differed, other than in where those convergences shape, in fact, my main point. The other thing that I'm not going to dwell on is the issue of group hostility, Jews and Irish towards each other. I won't, because I don't think it's terribly interesting, and I don't think it's very useful. Jews and Irish in America exhibited in words and deeds a vast range of reactions to each other, from animosity to marriage, from street gangs to meaningful friendships forged in the course of everyday life and in the political arena, and everything in between. By and large, the scholarly, and I'd say quasi-scholarly literature in American Jewish history posits a very deep vein of anti-Semitism among Irish Americans, usually attributed to Catholic theology, but for the most part, all such assertions are devoid of evidence. Okay? When you see them and you look for what us historians venerate, which are footnotes, they're not there. So these are imaginary, this is an imaginary hostility that are belied by the actual extent of relationship and interaction. So on to now the heart of my talk, and I'm going to use as the basis, just as my springboard here, an article which appeared a few years ago in the Forward, a weekly Jewish, used to be a newspaper, now it's a magazine because it only comes out once a week, in its March 17th edition. And due to the wonders of Google, when I put in Irish and Jewish, this article popped up. And the headline for the article was, quote, "How the Jews Made America Irish." Okay, now, I don't know where the headline came from. I don't know if it was from the imagination of the writer, a Robert F. Moss, who's identified as somebody who also writes for the Times and the New Republic, or if the forward happens to employ a headline writer. Either way, I'm taking them to task. Either way, the person assumed that this was clever, and it also speaks volumes about ethnic chauvinism, as it makes the Jews the the actors, the players, the teachers, the ones who had to speak for the Irish. And in the process of mentoring Irish women and men into the intricacies of American life, it was, according to this headline, the Jews who made America Irish. Now, the headline and the gist of the article are so silly and of such minor consequence as they may not be really worth dwelling upon, but it did give me a pretty nice springboard from which to launch my talk and to dive into the topic at hand. So what I would do to begin now, again, the heart of the talk, is to offer you two different alternative headlines to that article. And one could have been, "How the Irish and the Jews Together Made America." The other headline could be, "How the Irish Taught the Jews to Become American." Okay, so the first one, the partnership, we might think of in terms of a series of pairings, of dyads and triads, of real Jews and real Irish Americans who work together, and in that working together altered the landscape of American life. And I'm going to just spew forth a few of these pairings, and they are hardly exhaustive. They come from across the country and from the 19th century onward. In mid-19th century Boston, Rabbi Solomon Schindler labored locally in politics and in the world of letters with his friend John Boyle O'Reilly, the Irish-born Fenian, editor of the Boston Pilot, as well as his successor, Geoffrey Roach. Together, the three, Schindler and O'Reilly, Schindler and Roach, challenged the city's Protestant elite and its exclusionary policies vis-a-vis the power in the city. Or we might take a group of four fascinating women: Margaret Sanger, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn on the Irish side, Emma Goldman and Lillian Wald on the Jewish side. And these four, each in their own ways and together, forced America to redefine gender and public health and the relationships between men and women and class. Louis Sullivan, the Irish-born architect Louis Sullivan, and Dankmar Adler, the son of a very prominent Reform rabbi, changed the skyline of Chicago. They made it the city of skyscrapers, and together the two of them used their skyscraper vision to indeed influence the way American cities looked. Samuel Gompers, Dutch-born Jew of Polish parentage, along with P.J. McGuire and John McBride and Matthew McGuire, brought us nothing less than the American Federation of Labor, our first labor laws. And every September, let's think about that one Jew, Samuel Gompers, and those three Irishmen as we celebrate Labor Day. Okay, it was their idea. Rose Schneiderman and Leonora O'Reilly injected new vigor into the suffrage movement. Both socialist suffragists, O'Reilly and Schneiderman together, pressed the Socialist Party to allow working women to freely choose their potential supporters outside of the Socialist Party. And together, Schneiderman and O'Reilly pressed the suffrage movement to address the needs and concerns of working women. So it was these two women, one born in Ireland, one born in the Pale of Settlement, who got both the Socialist Party and the suffrage movement to understand the needs of women on the one hand, the working class on the other. Okay, and finally, although the list could go on, we are here in Glucksman Ireland House, and I am across the park in Hebrew and Judaic Studies, two products of the birth and flowering of ethnic studies in the mid-1960s. Okay, without that intellectual, academic upheaval, we wouldn't be here. And in some ways, we might lay the origins of that movement to a book written by Nathan Glazer and Daniel Patrick Moynihan, okay, Beyond the Melting Pot. And their work together, although they looked at other experiences as well, made the study of ethnicity a legitimate academic enterprise. So this list could go on, and even this brief one should indicate the degree to which the history of American labor, American feminism, birth control, public health, letters, and beyond brought Jews and Irish into contact with each other, and together they made America what it became. But beyond this pairing, these pairings and collaborations, I want to assert that in fact over the course of American history from the mid-19th century onward, the Irish played a particular role in the history of Jewish integration, a role that has been largely ignored, and one that I'd like to offer this evening. Any graduate students in here thinking about dissertation topics, I'm about to offer you many, okay? And this is how the Irish served as the mentors to American Jews, how they were their guides in learning the ropes of American life. Now, this role involves, for the most part, this was a very singular experience for both Jews and Irish, and it was a role that only the Irish could play for the Jews. Okay? No other group in America could do this for them. Unlike Germans and Poles, as well as the immigrants from other parts of Central and Eastern Europe, Jews came to America with no prehistory of contact with people from Ireland. Okay, this tiny Irish Jewish population is so small as to have had no impact on this narrative. And likewise, the Irish came to America with no prehistory of contact with the Jews. We could certainly not say this about Poles or Germans, who had been living with Jewish neighbors in one way or another since the Middle Ages. Okay, so the Irish-Jewish encounter with each other took place in America alone. It's a uniquely American story. Neither came with baggage about the other. The novelty of the encounter with the Irish teaching the Jews how to become American we couldn't say this might be also a story about the Jewish encounter with Italian immigrants. Okay, the timing was just off. The largest flood of Jewish immigrants, the 3 million who come from Eastern Europe, commenced in the 1870s, a point in time when Irish immigrants and their children had already set in motion a set of institutions and practices which emerged as the model which the Jews followed. On the other hand, the Italian flood came later. It's not until the 1890s, and therefore, just chronologically, they were behind the Jews, and as such were not in a position to teach them much about America at all. Italians also, too many of them went back to Italy, and as such were too far removed from American politics to be able to be the on-the-ground guides to how to proceed from the margins to the center. Likewise, the Jewish encounter with other immigrants, those defined by law as non-white, namely the Chinese, but other as well, deserves tremendous amount of study. But again, these men, and some women among them, could not have been the mentors or teachers for Jewish newcomers learning to navigate America, because the legal and civic stigmatization that went along with being defined as not white removed them from active involvement in the political system. Those who, by virtue of their color, could not vote, could not run for office, could not use politics as an avenue for integration and group defense, they couldn't hold municipal jobs and the like, could not be marshaled by Jews in order to learn the way to become American. So in all of this, the relationship between the Irish and the Jews, with the Irish as the guides, leaders, was unreplicated in any other ethnic encounter in America. So what were those ways in which the Irish taught the Jews to be American? Well, first, Jews in America came to realize that they needed defenders. They needed voices in positions of authority and prominence and power who could speak for them. And this is the first way in which the Irish taught Jews how to become American. So from the 1880s on, as Jews were looking for allies in their quest for security, they turned to well-connected, politically sophisticated, what they saw Irish Americans, to be their voice. So 1893, the same year that a group of Protestant elite Bostonians banded together to found the Immigration Restriction League, the year that the American Jewish Historical Society was founded as a defense against attacks against the Jews, claiming that they were unassimilable as newcomers to American life. Max Kohler, a constitutional lawyer and a son of very important rabbi, turned to Charles P. Daly, born in County Galway, then the Chief Justice of the New York Court of Common Pleas, to write and publish the first history of the Jews of the United States. It's the first book we have that seeks to tell the history of of Jews in North America, and the title is called The Settlement of the Jews in North America. A rousing tribute to the Jews came from the pen of Charles P. Daly. Daly asserted in his book that Jews had been present since the 17th century and could be hardly seen as alien to American life. The same year, again prodded by Kohler, Daly published a smaller book called The Jews of New York. Again, it's the first book on that subject, and it was again a defense of the Jews, showing how they were an integral part of the life of the city from the city's first years. The book appeared under the publishing imprimatur of a man by the name of Philip Cowan, who was the editor and publisher of the American Hebrew, which was the publication whose quote I began with. He was an important Jewish civic activist of his day, and his relationship with Kohler, I could have put that in the pairings, but more importantly, we see this defense of the Jews coming from an Irish American with a wide distribution for the larger American public. A few years later, American Jewry once again turned to an Irish person, an Irish man, to defend the Jews. And again, this was something that produced a text that is singular in history. This is the case of Michael David's Within the Pale, The True History of the Anti-Semitic Persecution in Russia. David was an Irish nationalist, a journalist, a bigger-than-life figure, and he was sent by the Hearst newspapers to cover the aftermath of the Kishinev pogrom, which flared April 19th, 20th in the Moldavian city of Kishinev. And this has become a classic work. But what is notable is that David, when he came to Kishinev and began sending back his reports, he was immediately approached by the Jewish Publication Society of America, which asked him to take all of his articles and to bundle them together into a single book, which is Within the Pale. And obviously the word pale is very interesting because it obviously has resonance in both Irish and Jewish history. So when the Jewish Publication Society wanted a book on the pogrom, they wanted American readers to know how devastating it was, how the Jews were victims of brutal mob violence, they didn't turn to another Jew to write the book. They turned to a notable person from Ireland, both a very strong American connection, to be their mouthpiece to the larger society. So that these American Jews, like Cowan and Kohler vis-a-vis Daly and the Jewish Publication Society vis-a-vis David, turned to Irish-American activists, political figures, individuals associated with Irish communal life, offers us a compelling narrative of our topic at hand. American Jews saw their Irish neighbors, literally or metaphorically, as politically savvy, well-connected, as powerful players in American life, and as such links to a community that they wanted to emulate, from whom they were going to learn the intricacies of navigating American politics. Now, it is not at all incidental to our story tonight that Jews coming to America settled for the most part in the nation's largest cities, New York mostly, but also Philadelphia and Chicago, and they'd entered into a world in which Irish men dominated the world of politics, from the street corner on up. The history of Irish skill in the machinery of American urban politics has been told elsewhere in great detail, and suffice it to say here that the path by which they learned to use politics and make it their own paved a path for all white men, or white male immigrants, not just Jews. But for Jews, this was an important moment in time. For the most part, they arrived in America with little or no experience in the political dance of being wooed, courted, and appealed to by non-Jewish men with power and influence for the simple purpose of just getting their vote. That is, they came from places where that wasn't the nature of political life. So that in every city Jews went to, New York at the top of the roster, they encountered Irish politicians, starting with the ward captains on their street and up the ladder, who wanted and lusted after their votes. Okay, nothing else, they just wanted their votes. After all, in the rough and tumble of American politics, the only thing that counted was the vote. Irish political operatives showed up at Jewish weddings and at funerals, at bar mitzvahs, at synagogue dedications, at the meetings of B'nai B'rith lodges, at Landsmannschaften, the hometown societies, and so many other gatherings. Here, these men who themselves had been born in Ireland or whose parents had showed up often and said how much they liked and cared about and valued and needed these new Jewish male voters. As one commentator noted about Tammany Hall in 1893, the same year that Charles Patrick Daly published his celebratory history of America and New York Jewry, quote, "Tammany knows no race or creed when it comes to a question of acquiring or preserving political power. Some of its election captains are Jews. No reflection of an ideology of cultural pluralism or belief in multiculturalism or a belief in cross-ethnic solidarity. Rather, the behavior of Tammany and its counterparts in Boston, Buffalo, Albany, Pittsburgh, Chicago, St. Louis, and on, reflected hard-nosed politics. Jewish men naturalized, they became citizens, they voted, and somebody's going to get their vote, and why not us?" Okay, why not us? Let's listen to Martin Lamosny, the child of immigrants from Fermoy, a Massachusetts politician who served as state senator, state representative, and alderman, best known as the political boss of the West End. Nicknamed the Mahatma because of his uncanny ability to deliver votes for his preferred candidate, Lamosny controlled Ward 8 and wielded considerable influence in city and state politics for over 40 years. He noted as he looked back on his life in politics about Boston in the 1890s, quote, "The population of Ward 8 was not static. It became a one-way station for the continuous migration of Boston's transient nationalities. The Jews began to move in the 1890s, and in 15 years had become the dominant group. For them, the West End was a proving ground of social and financial ambition. That the child of Fermoy immigrants could retain his Mahatma status among the Jews of the West End bore witness to the power of the Irish-dominated machine to teach Jewish immigrants how to function in American local politics and beyond. As Jews, ward by ward, city by city, got their first starts upwards in urban politics, whether as operatives for the machine, as employees of city bureaucracies, or as candidates, and if successful as office holders, they for the most part emulated the Irish-American model. They learned and followed the Irish script. No vote is not worth pursuing. No constituency ought to be ignored. Potential voters become real voters for you and your organization when their needs are met, be it a city job, a contract, a word with the right official with clout, and so on. Now, it's not that Jewish politics exactly resembled Irish politics, particularly in New York. The Socialist Party had a pretty substantial following among Jewish voters, but for the most part, Jews followed that Irish script, creating ethnic alliances, working the streets, reaching out to new groups of voters, whoever they were, rewarding them with patronage and assistance, and out of that loyalty flowed, came right out of the Irish playbook. The political lessons imparted by the Irish pioneers to their Jewish latecomers, as it were, transcended the very local. It manifested itself in global politics as well, and here I want to cite the work of my former doctoral student, Judah Bernstein, who unfortunately couldn't come tonight, and I told him I would give him a shout out if he were here, but anyhow, his superb dissertation on Zionist politics in America in early 20th century laid bare an important theme. American Zionists admired, paid homage to, took their cues from Irish American nationalist politics as it trained its sight on the struggles back home. Who could say it more clearly than one of those American Zionists, a young attorney who lived in Springfield, Massachusetts, Abraham Camber, as quoted by Bernstein. The quote, "The Irish race has taught us," so he's very clear, it's the Irish taught us, "the Irish race has taught us the value and benefit to be derived from organizing for united action, be it political or otherwise." One leader of American Zionism, Richard Gottheil, waxed eloquent about Irish nationalists as he lamented the weakness of Zionists. And he said, basically, the Irish know how to be unified. We're a disaster at this. Okay? And he, again, Gottheil writes, "No more fervent or devoted nationalists exist today than the Americans of Irish extraction. We cannot take up a newspaper without being convinced that the thoughts of Irish Americans are constantly occupied with their interests and with the interests of the country from which they came." Okay, and finally, a 1916 article in the Yiddish Tagblatt, written from a correspondent in Cincinnati, urged the paper's readers to pay attention to the Irish and their uncompromising devotion to homeland. The Irish as a whole are interested in every way and detail of the home rule movement. They are all in favor of it. Now we know that's not true, but they're all in favor of it. They are not divided into factions. They are all one. Now the article juxtaposed the Irish unity and Irish zeal to the weakness of American Jewry to rally behind the Zionist cause. So politics offers us one venue to see this mentorship and guidance. The second one, which also in the end involves politics, is that Jews had some very important learning their experiences at the knees of their Irish Catholic teachers, starting in the middle of the 19th century, as New York, Chicago, and other cities, and Cincinnati happens to be one for which we have a good deal of documentation, in the vigorous campaigns mounted by Catholic leaders, all of Irish birth, against the profoundly Protestant nature of public school instruction, replete with mandatory school prayers and reading of the King James Bible. The Irish Catholic campaign against the reading of the King James Bible drew the attention of rabbis and other Jewish communal notables concerned about the evangelical agenda and how it was going to impact Jewish children. Irish Catholic leaders showed American Jews how to fight the Protestant establishment. So just one example very quickly, in Cincinnati was Archbishop John Purcell, born in Mallow, County Cork, in 1820, who explained in his words and actions to the Jews he worked with, particularly to Rabbis Isaac Mayer Wise and Max Lilienthal, that they had to confront the Protestant school board directly. Okay? That they had to argue not that it was going to be offensive or not that it was harmful, but that it was against American law. That separation of church and state meant you couldn't have Protestant worship and Protestant Bible reading. Now, much of the growth of the Cincinnati diocese came from German migration, the fact of Purcell's Irish birth and socialization, the vigorous stand he took against Bible reading, and his extensive meetings with Rabbi Wise and Rabbi Lilienthal on strategizing to confront the city's Protestant school leaders provide us with an example of the Jews seeing and hearing from their Irish Catholic teachers how to press their claims as Americans. A similar tale can be told about New York and Archbishop Hughes in the 1840s and 50s and his fight with the New York School Society and the New York Legislature. In this case, it was newspaper editor Samuel Isaacs, editor of the Jewish Messenger, who waxed eloquent about Hughes. Hughes was the one who knew how to do it. We have to learn from him. Okay, and meetings between Hughes and Isaacs showed the way in which Isaacs took his cues, coming up ultimately with very different responses, but yet the enemy was the same, the Protestant school establishment. So that offers us, again, a second venue for this. And finally, as it's the last zone, since I wanted to stress how the Irish in America taught Jews to become America and how they remade America, let me then end with teaching literally. So it may be that this is the most crucial setting in which Irish Americans taught the Jews to be American, the one in which mattered the most. American Jewish historians and those who have helped construct and perpetuate a narrative about Jews in America, their success, economic in particular, have focused on education. They have had so much to say about the movement of Jewish boys and girls from their immigrant journeys in steerage to American middle class and professional life via the engine of education, public education in particular. The American Jews have created a romantic homage to the public schools, particularly in New York, and the trajectory by which so many came from families where parents labored in sweatshops and factories, struggled to earn their living as pushcart peddlers and slaves to shabby and derelict stores, becoming then doctors and lawyers and accountants and teachers and so on. The story is much more complicated than that, but that is the story they like to tell. Now, this is not the place to dissect that narrative, which resonates so deeply with American Jews, but I want to add a missing element, because usually that story is told about the Jewish devotion to education and the Jewish love of learning and how Jewish parents push their kids to go to school and so on. But we have to remember that almost all of those Jewish children in New York found themselves, when they made their way to public schools, sitting at desks, facing teachers, women, whose mothers and fathers had been born in Ireland. By the latter part of the 19th century, young and not so young Irish American women made up the backbone of the public school teaching force. As early as the 1870s, just as the East European Jewish migration was taking off, over 20% of New York's public school teachers were Irish women, and as the century waned and the new one took off, the numbers rose. The job offered these young women, and again, not necessarily so young, since many of them did not marry and stayed in their jobs, the jobs offered them steady employment, clean working conditions, reasonable pay for women at a time when women had very few options to make better salary. As a job, school teaching tended to be unscathed by the ups and downs of the capitalist economy with its panics, downturns, slowdowns, which devastated the lives of factory workers. Furthermore, in the big cities, New York in particular, public school teaching fell into the domain of the political machine, which, as you already know, meant it fell into the domain of Irish men who could do favors for their constituents by getting their daughters teaching jobs. The New York experience was replicated in Chicago, San Francisco, Albany, Philadelphia, and these are the ones just that we have some data, and not enough. And by the 1920s, as the Jewish migration was continuing, school teaching was the 5th most common occupation for second-generation Irish women. And it was these women who served on the front lines of exposing newly arrived Jewish immigrant children to literally what it meant to be American. It was these Irish women, mostly the daughters of women who had migrated from Ireland. They showed them by virtue of their dress, their speech, their comportment, the ideal of American middle-class life. It mattered little that these Irish teachers may have, and probably most did, came from working class homes. It mattered little that many of their mothers may have once been domestic servants and their fathers manual laborers. To the Jewish immigrant children, and from what we can glean from the very spotty historic record, their awestruck parents, okay, that is the immigrants themselves, who knew English, these women served as the standard bearers of American culture. They led the Jewish youngsters in the Pledge of Allegiance, taught them how to put their little hands over their hearts. They taught them the patriotic songs, informed these youngsters about Thanksgiving, Lincoln's birthday, Washington's birthday, as well as drilling them in spelling, reading, math, social studies, and the like. These Irish American women served on the front lines of integration as new Jewish immigrants entered their classrooms, arriving consistently with no English at their command and expected by their parents to master American skills. If Jews at the time, the leaders, writers, communal activists, as well as ordinary women and men on the Jewish street, placed great stock in education as the vehicle to propel their children's mobility and to transform immigrant children into Americans able to take advantage of the economic, cultural, and political, cultural and political future of the community, then acknowledged or not, and usually it's not acknowledged, they entrusted their future to the Irish women to shepherd their children into citizenship. As a very brief digression, I cannot state emphatically, and again this is to the graduate students who are thinking about dissertations, how much more we need to know about this encounter and what a contribution this would be to a study of New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, and elsewhere. It would be a gold mine for immigration history, women's history, the history of education, let alone for Irish and American Jewish history. But to return to our story and to bring this towards an end, the Jewish children, boys and girls, in fact, did have very high rates of school attendance, and they went en masse to public schools, with Jewish parochial or day schools nearly unheard of. So what went on in the public schools has to be understood as the crucial analytic factor in explaining the process of socialization which they experienced and the outcomes they achieved. Perhaps we can illustrate this phenomenon, something which would involve collectively hundreds of thousands of teachers and millions of students over the course of the decades from the 1870s through the 1920s in every large American city through the story of one young woman, Myra Kelly. So Myra Kelly was born in Dublin. She came to the United States with her father, a physician, who established a practice on the Lower East Side. So that's also very interesting. Her father was a doctor who set up his office on the Lower East Side and treated Jewish patients. She herself came from a quite privileged background, attended the Horace Mann School and Teachers College, Columbia, graduating in 1899. Kelly taught elementary school at public school PS 147 in the heart of the Jewish East Side enclave just for a few years. And we know her and we know her name as opposed to all the other women who we don't know about because she decided to translate her classroom experiences into literature. And she produced 3 collections of stories based on her experiences as a teacher with such aptly titled books as Little Citizens of 1904 and Little Aliens of 1910. Her character, Constance Bailey, teaches Russian Jewish immigrant children and some Irish children as well the intricacies and puzzles of American life. While her books involve a minor theme about the changing ethnic character of the neighborhood and the displacement of the Irish immigrant families as the Jews arrive, her sweet tales, and they're incredibly saccharine, still offer us a very small and I'd say suggestive window into what was a large and profound historical phenomenon, the meeting between Irish Americans literally as teachers and the Jews who learned from them. So she wrote one short story in the late 1890s, let's give it a minute, called A Christmas Present for a Lady for the Golden Book magazine, a magazine for children. Delightful, redemptive story. The protagonist teacher with a capital T is the embodiment of being a lady for her students who have such names as Isidore Applebaum, Sadie Gnorowitz, Bertha Binderowitz, Nathan Horowitz, and the hero of the story, a brand new, newly arrived immigrant whom the other kids mock as greenie, named Morris Mogilevsky. Charming story about the love that flourished between teacher and all the children, and the desire of these Jewish children to give a Christmas present to Lady. Kelly's sweet presentation of the classroom reads utterly unrealistic. We assume some of these children are pretty horrible and were not terribly dutiful to her. But this story, like others in her full-length books, reveals something about the ways in which Irish women school teachers, the fictional teacher here, or Constance Bailey, or the real-life Kelly, and the hundreds of thousands of others served as the embodiment of middle-class American behavior for these newly arrived. The untold and unacknowledged lessons imparted by the Irish as they taught Jews to become Americans continued into the 1920s. They literally, again, teaching. By the 1920s, the daughters of Jewish immigrants who had arrived at the turn of the century began to enter this same field, and now they met Irish women as their colleagues, as their senior colleagues in the schools, as the principals who ran the schools, as the examiners for the Board of Education for the licensing exams, and as the supervisor, as their supervisors. Oh, what if we could, historians, have recreated the conversations between them in the teachers' lunchrooms and in the meeting halls of the teachers' union, where both Irish and Jewish women worked assiduously to unionize school teachers and say even though they were professionals and highly educated, they were still workers and deserved the rights that other laborers had. So by the 1920s, as many Jewish women began to enter New York City public school teaching, many of them received their education, their training at something called the Maxwell He Training School. So here was a teacher training institute, and here teachers were almost all Irish women who were now teaching others to become teachers. One of the Jewish women who had been a student at Maxwell and went on to a long career in the New York City public schools left us a little memoir, which is worth just a minute. So she remembered how her Maxwell teachers were the daughters of immigrant women who had first been, and this is in the memoir, had first been domestic servants in some of the city's, quote, finest homes. According to this informant, the Maxwell educators, the Irish women, had learned from their mothers, the one-time Irish servant girls, okay, now I'm going to go on to the quote, the oh-so-proper manners, and they tried to teach the same to us. In the spirit of noblesse oblige, we Jewish girls who went to Maxwell were forever invited to their, meaning the teachers, genteel tea parties. We who drank tea at home from a glass, okay, were taught how to drink from a cup. They taught us how to lift our pinkies when we drank to be just like our teachers. Teachers, this memoir said, were the ones who taught us that to be a teacher meant one had to be a lady, and we should learn how to be a lady by emulating them, implying that we Jewish women had no idea what being a lady meant and needed their help along the way. Now, what this particular woman made of the lessons in manners and leadership, in tea drinking and pinky lifting, is less important than the fact that she and her cohort then became the backbone of the teaching force from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and how interesting it would be to know if they imparted that same lesson to their proteges, which were primarily African American women coming in to teach. Okay, the teaching from the Irish down to the Jews took place in one other educational setting, which again, I want to say screams out for analysis, and I can only give it a minute because not only is the time getting late, but also nobody has bothered studying it. And this is the very significant history of Jewish men in particular from the 1920s on, in fact even a little bit earlier, and well into the 1940s and 1950s, who sought admission to college and then law and medical school at Catholic universities. They're all founded by Irish orders, and all enrolling a predominantly Irish student body. The random histories we have, and right now that's exactly what they are, random, which obviously makes a historian feel a little crazy, that they're random, of Georgetown, Fordham, Creighton in Omaha, Providence College, Loyola of Chicago, Loyola of Baltimore, draw our attention to the presence and acceptance of Jewish students at Catholic institutions, and institutions founded by Irish Americans and enrolled in Irish American students. Deeply steeped in the mission of Catholic learning, none of these institutions maintain quotas against Jews at a time when nearly every private institution in America that's, quote, that was maybe no longer officially Protestant, but Protestant founding, had quotas against Jews. Okay, the Catholic institutions did not. Most of the students who attended places like Providence College and Creighton and Fordham and Georgetown and so on tended to be the sons of immigrants who lived in Omaha, South Bend, Providence, the Bronx, and so on, who lived at home with their parents and went to the local Catholic institution. This was true, for example, by the way, also at Notre Dame, home of the Fighting Irish. And local South Bend boys of East European immigrant families, a few of whom actually played football, wearing the Fighting Irish uniform. One of these graduates, a man by the name of Elbert Plotkin, class of 42, went on to become a rabbi. And he paid homage to his Catholic college years. He said going to Notre Dame instilled in him, quote, a feeling that religion must become part and parcel of one's entire being. It cannot be put into a small corner and opened up once a week and then closed. Going to Notre Dame made me rethink my own faith, the power it must play, and the function I must use in my own life. And again, I thought his next sentence is really interesting. I shared in exchanges of ideas of faith and knowledge with my fellow students, and I learned to appreciate many of the qualities of their faith. Now, the only fairly empirical study we have is a recent history of Fordham's Law School, and at no time was Fordham's Law School less than 10% Jewish. And in that particular book, we have a very eloquent statement by the longtime New York State Attorney General Louis Lefkowitz, again the son of Jewish immigrants who lived in the Bronx, that his experience at Fordham was absolutely shaping to his life as a Jewish communal activist, as well as his life in law and politics. So at Fordham, at Fordham Law School, Jewish students were never less than 10% of the student body. So I offer this as a teaser because there's so much that we should know about this. So in this context, as well as in the others I have shared with you, and the many that I couldn't because of the space of this one evening, I hope it made clear that not only did the Jews not make America Irish, the Irish did that for themselves, as that poor headline writer for the Forward tried to claim, but rather the history of the Jews and the Irish and the history of the United States, its labor movement, its struggle about the role of religion in political life, the provision of public education, the pursuit of politics, was a case, in fact, where Irish and Jews worked together to remake America, and in that, however, in that it was the Irish who taught the Jews to become American. Thank you.
Well, we now questions. Hasia.
Okay.
Draw your breath for a
Okay.
second, and everybody think.
Okay, Peter.
Don't you think one of the most powerful instruments the Jews and Irish shared, the Irish one before the Jews, was popular entertainment? I'm thinking the Irish invented minstrelsy.
Right.
And the two great minstrels of the early 20th century are Sophie Tucker and
Jolson and Cantor.
Jolson, yeah.
Absolutely, and I have to say I purposely left that out because I know Mick is going to be giving a presentation on music and popular culture, and I didn't want to intrude on his space. But yes, I mean, it's very important to actually parse out the way in which the kind of baton was time, the overlap with Irish and Jews at the same time and whether not just minstrelsy, but vaudeville, Tin Pan Alley, okay, and the movies, which Larry Barron is going to be talking to us about, and then how the baton gets passed. So yes, it's very important, but I just felt that was his zone, and he knows much more about it than I do. Ted.
Thank you for a brilliant and rousing lecture and provocative one. Of course, the Jews have a lot to teach the Irish, and Loretta, who heads up the most successful Irish philanthropy, the Ireland Funds, their motto is to look Irish, dress British, and think Yiddish. And it's done it so well so far. But my question to you is, would you hazard how you think the identities of Jewish America and Irish America will be in the next 50 years, or is that outside?
Totally. I said, no good historian will ever answer a question. Because obviously it's always contingent. We don't know what events are going to happen that will, I know we can predict one direction, and some events will just completely turn it. If I had to hazard, and I would just say this as a very vague kind of answer, that the kinds of bases for identity that we have inherited from our own pasts and that seem to still be very palpable to us will go in new directions. And the way in which people are Jewish or Irish now is certainly not what they were in 1900 or 1850. And just as that evolved to where, let's say, we are now, just as that is a process of historical evolution and change, something new is going to have to, will morph out of our present. And in a sense, as long as an entity is a living, breathing organism, an ethnic population, that is, if it still has meaning, it has to change. If it freezes, that's because it's dead. Okay?
Hasia, just because our mics are not working tonight, if you would repeat the
Oh,
question
absolutely.
for this room or vice versa.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, that's okay. Just, I think that's yeah.
Yes.
Did you find any significant differences in how German Jews and Eastern European Jews interacted with the Irish, and in particular, do German Jews look down on Irish Catholic immigrants and try to identify more with the Protestant elite?
Okay, so the question is difference between East European German Jews who come earlier, Jews from Central Europe, versus the later arrivals, the much larger population from Eastern Europe that begins to arrive in the 1870s. Difference in terms of their interaction with Irish, and did the earlier group kind of look down upon the Irish? Well, we don't know. I mean, that's really not studied, but any number of the people who I cited, so for example, Isaac Meyer Wise and Max Lilienthal working with the Archbishop of Cincinnati to kick the Bible out of public school, these are immigrants from Central Europe. Okay, so they also saw the Catholic Irish assault on the Protestant nature of public schools as something worth emulating. In those Zionists I quoted, Richard Gothiel could not have been more Central European, more dignified, American educated. I think he graduated from Columbia. And he says the Irish taught us, are the ones who we have to emulate as Zionists. And the Yiddish Tagblatt, an Orthodox Yiddish paper, says the same thing. So now, when you would want to get down to street level, I think there probably were some differences, and they're more a matter of class than was they East European versus German. And so we do have some little bits and pieces sprinkled through literature about Irish women who work as domestic servants in well-off Jewish homes. Okay, and I think does the New York Irish Roundtable still exist?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because I remember reading when I was working on Hungering for America, a couple of the memoirs in there where, for example, my mother worked, as a servant for an Irish, for a Jewish family, and I learned, and she learned how to cook gefilte fish and so on. But yet, let's turn that story on its head, and there's the young Jewish woman who goes to the Maxwell Training School, And she sees the fact that her teacher's mother had been a servant, a domestic servant, as like, she really knew manners. I mean, she had been, so, I think that it's kind of more complicated, but it'd probably be worth looking, for example, again, it's a dissertation for somebody looking at a neighborhood which we call Klein Deutschland, okay, which the Lower East Side was part of, and there was a time when it was Irish, okay, and German Christian, and German Jewish. And what were the qualities of interaction on Chatham Street? Okay, and nobody's looked at that. But so, in fact, now that I think about your question, it's a great one for somebody to work on. Okay, yes?
Original baseball heroes were Irishmen, and I know John McGraw in New York always wanted some Jews on his team because he knew that that would bring in some Jewish fans. So I think that possibly the youth could pick up on the Kellys who were first heroes in baseball.
Okay, so it was a statement about baseball, not necessarily a question, and I'm sure that would be really interesting also that the earliest baseball players, some of them, I think actually many of them were American Protestants of rural background, but that some of the notable people in early baseball were Irish and they wanted to bring in Jewish players. That's very possible, and I think that would be interesting. It's certainly not in my zone of interest. Miriam.
One of the gauges we use in terms of, and I know you didn't talk about hostility, and this is the opposite, I suppose, and it's an example of Loretta and Lou. I was just wondering how much intermarriage came up in your research in terms of how much it occurred, or just general observations on it.
Right, okay, so the question is about intermarriage between Irish and Jews. And so partly, the program we're having in March by Professor Lawrence Barron looks at these marriages as depicted in movies like 80s Irish Rose and the Kellys and the Cohens, and it was a very significant theme in American popular culture, and as a theme it was going to be there because it represented some kind of reality. In other words, it wasn't a kind of outlandish kind of pairing that was just funny, but rather it represented something that existed on the ground. There are two studies of intermarriage from the early part of the 20th century. One, unfortunately, was done in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, which there were just very few Jews there, but there are a few examples in that study of Jews and Irish marrying. The larger one comes from the 1920s in New York, and it was pretty substantial, given that Jewish exogamy was pretty rare at that point in time. Relatively little Jewish outmarriage. But when the researcher looks for, okay, who did Jews marry, who were not, when Jews married out, who did they marry? Irish were the single largest group, okay, and then Italians. Okay, and so now, again, it's one of those studies that, or one of those questions that I think because, and this is sort of how I began, we tend to think in silos. There's Irish American history, there's American Jewish history, there's Italian, and then there's the occasional look outward, but there's very little that's crossover. And again, the course that Bob Scally started and that Marion and I have done, I think is probably very few places, across the landscape of American academia does such a course exist. And it really is important because that's when you start going beyond the boundary of the group and start looking at interactions, relationships, then you're going to start getting that. And you'd certainly be able, and it's doable because marriage licenses are available for study. And while last names are not necessarily a totally perfect gauge of identity, birthplace certainly would be, and last names are at least a way to start. So it's a very doable project, but it just hasn't been done.
And dispensation records, if any of the Archdiocesan archives will have you need a dispensation to marry out. Yeah.
Okay.
Anyone else? Okay. Well, thank you. I mean, we're off to a tremendous start. and always when you can encourage students to run with something, I think it's been a success. And please join us downstairs for a reception.